Okay, this is the training to meet the certification requirements. It's on batterers, BEP, and stalking. And I've got 14 people signed up, so we'll see. We might be a little delayed. I'm going to just play it by ear and see what happens as far as getting people here. Oh, well, apparently I'm just having technical difficulties in general because this doesn't have my email going through to everybody. Okay, well, so much for that. So nobody did get a thing asking me to delay it. So we will go ahead as planned. Let me pull up our PowerPoints. I've had to reboot several times, so I keep opening these. You'd think they would be just kind of stuck now. There we go. We're going to start with batterers. Ta-da, ta-da. Handouts for this are on the ICADVA webpage. So, you know, it's just icadva.org. And then if you look under the Resources tab in the Resource Library, very first thing there is Training Manuals for Advocates. And when you click on that, you'll see the training manuals. Now, of course, these are for the previous certification, and now we just last week got board approval, so it's been changed. But it's still pretty much the same. We just have to do a little label difference. So the first manual is for that first 20 hours. It's required by law. And then what's level 2 now, they're not going to be level, so it'll just be a certified domestic abuse advocate. The training manual will be the same with the addition of a couple other sections. So the section that we're going to be dealing with, section 2 on batterers, all of that information is still what you need, and section 8 on stalking. So hopefully you had a chance to look at those or will look at them when we're done. And looks like most of the names I've got on here are folks that have tried this webinar thing before, so I'm going to assume you're at least somewhat familiar with it and comfortable with it. If you have questions, you can either IM the question, you can unmute and ask it, however you want to deal with it. You can click on the little button there at the top of your panel that says how to raise your hand. It's got a little hand symbol. You can click on that, and then I know to unmute you and that you can ask a voice question. And typing in chat box works great too. So I will try and keep track of questions and hands raised and all of that good stuff. Okay. So batterers. Ta-da. Let me get this going. I just want to go through a couple of the common myths, and these are things that when you are out presenting to the public, you are going to hear all the time. So this just helps to give you some language that you can use to talk to people about the actual causes of domestic violence. One really common one is that it's just that people, they're using and whatever substance that makes people violent. And while it's true that batterers might use prior to an assault, quite often they're not over the legal limit. They're not actually intoxicated to the extent that they can't control what they're doing. And some of the research on how many batterers do use, about half of them have considerable substance abuse problems, but the other half do not. And in fact, about a third of them almost never drink or use substances. So you can't say batterers batter because of the substances. Sometimes victims will talk about that. They'll say, well, he only batters me when he's using. But if you ask about the other things on the power and control wheel, they're doing those things all the time. It's just that they're not using the physical violence, except when they have that excuse of, well, I was drunk, so I didn't know what I was doing. And I think that we kind of acknowledge that in our culture in the saying that the worst drunk is a dry drunk. And so that when you take the alcohol out of the situation, the battering doesn't go away. So we can send folks to battering treatment. We can send them to substance abuse treatment. If they just do the substance abuse treatment, the battering doesn't disappear. They have to do both. I will say, however, that it doesn't make things any easier for that particular partner because it can increase the lethality, the riskiness of it. A batterer who's using might be more volatile, might, shall we say, kill unintentionally. So it can make things worse, even though it isn't the cause. Okay, the other really common thing that I hear from people is, well, they're just crazy. There's something wrong with them mentally. And, well, about 10–15% of them do show diagnosable pathologies. In other words, if you gave them the MMPI or some other measure of mental health, they would come up with a diagnosable mental illness. And those illnesses are usually depression, anxiety, and things like antisocial personality disorder. But the rest of them show up normal. And that's always very disconcerting for the public because they want there to be something wrong with these people that's explainable, and that's why they're doing it. And it allows them to separate themselves from those nasty, evil batterers. The fact is that when we look at people with mental illnesses, they're much, much more likely to be victimized by violence than to be perpetrators of violence. This is an extremely vulnerable population. They're more likely to be raped, they're more likely to be assaulted, and when you're working with survivors with mental illness, as you probably already found out, they have a lot of additional barriers, even in terms of credibility. So the way the mental illness actually plays into domestic violence is in terms of making it harder for victims, not as an explanation for the violence. Probably the next most common thing people want to say is, well, they were abused as kids. That's what they learned, so that's what they do. They think it's normal. They think it's okay. And again, when we survey batters, and all of this research that I've talked about so far, this has all been done on heterosexual men. So does it apply to gay batterers? Does it apply to lesbian batterers? Well, I can't say that with any certainty. But what I can say is for men who've been arrested and convicted of domestic violence, that's kind of the population, heterosexual men that we're dealing with when I'm talking here. The majority of them, about 50% of them were abused as children, okay? And about 75% of them did witness their mother being abused. So you could also say, well, half of them were not abused, so we can't, if that's the cause, how do we explain that other half? 25% of them have no family history, so how do we explain a substantial portion? So it can't be a cause. Is there a risk factor there? Absolutely. And if we talk about battering as being caused by learning, then being battered, watching mom be battered and see how it gets your needs met, how it works, how you get power and control, that's where the connection is, not in experiencing the abuse yourself, but in a learning environment where you see that it works. Because we do know that the majority of victims of child abuse do not go on to perpetrate. If they did, then the majority of perpetrators would be female, and they're not. So those are some things you can talk about with people who are struggling with that whole issue of where do these folks come from. Other things that people throw out all the time when I'm training is heredity or genetics. Sometimes this is as, well, men are just more violent. I call this the testosterone poisoning theory, that men are somehow pre-programmed, and people will often blame it on testosterone, to simply be more violent. Well, that doesn't work cross-culturally, because there are a few small cultures in which women show more, are perceived within the culture as being more violent, as being more aggressive, et cetera, and the men are perceived in the culture as having the gender attributes that we assign as feminine here. And what you see is genetics and heredity don't play into it. It's a matter of what is perceived as normal within that culture, who ends up showing more aggression. I also have heard this in the context of just sheer racism. Well, that group, whatever that group is it African Americans, is it Mexicans, is it whoever they're talking about, well, those people are just naturally more violent. And in a less, well, at least not blaming it on genetics, but if I want to tie that to just the cultural argument, well, those people culturally are more violent, whatever group they're talking about. I will talk about how, well, actually, American culture is one of the most violent in the world. You know, we have the highest rate of homicides compared to just about anywhere else in the world, and certainly anywhere else in the Western part of the world. When there was a really interesting study done on Latin American immigrants here, and what they found is that first-generation immigrants actually had lower rates of domestic violence than second-generation. So Mexican Americans actually had higher rates of domestic violence than Mexicans who had immigrated here and become American. So there's something about the process of Americanization that actually has increased domestic violence in families. So it isn't those people over there who are genetically or culturally more violent. American culture itself is violent. The massive trio of being out of control, anger, and stress, those are favorites. I don't know about you, but I get stressed and I get angry, and I know that I can't do those things, and so I don't actually hurt people. These are kind of tricky because batters do often look angry, but that's a bluff. I mean, they want to blame their anger, and it looks like anger. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, about why it looks like anger. But we've sent folks to anger management. It didn't stop their battering. You can give batters nice happy pills. They shouldn't be stressed out anymore. They still batter. Now they're just happy, relaxed batterers. And there's lots of folks who feel out of control, etc. I was at a batterers group up in Fort Dodge one time and watching the group, and the facilitator wrote on the board in front of them, "I will not use violence." And he asked the guys, raise your hand if you think you can agree with that. And honestly, I think none of the guys raised their hands. And he said, well, why not? Why can't you agree with that? And the guys kind of conversed amongst themselves, and they came to the conclusion, one of them kind of spoke for the group and said, well, because everybody gets angry sometimes. And
I'm sure they're aware of it, but I'm sure they're aware of it.
I'm not sure if that's a question or if that's background noise I'm hearing.
Probably are. I'm not.
Anyway,
I go ahead and send it.
I lost my train of thought. So he said everybody gets angry sometimes, and the facilitator said, well, then you must lose a lot of jobs. And the guys kind of talked amongst themselves like, no. And he said, well, why not? Don't you ever get angry at work? And again, they had to kind of, yeah, well, sure. And then one of them really expressed what they came up with, which is that, well, no, you don't do that stuff at work. You do get angry at work, but you don't batter at work, because you only do that stuff at home where you can get away with it. And they literally said those words. So obviously they had an understanding that it really wasn't tied to anger. It was around what you felt like you had, what you were allowed to do, and what you had the right to do. Okay. Moving right along, behavior of the victim. I just talk about how these are serial criminals, and so if it's about this particular victim, when that victim leaves, how come then they do it to their next partner and their next partner and their next partner? So it must not be about who they're with. And then communication problems. These folks can communicate extremely well. In fact, being able to manipulate is one of the hallmarks of batterer behavior. So apparently, when they choose to communicate, they can do it. It's just a matter of what form they choose to communicate in and what is the motivation behind the communication. Okay, so we've gotten rid of all of that. What then are the causes of domestic abuse? And here we're talking about social norms and what is learned. As I said, our culture values control. Again, we have this standing joke or perception that when the Martians land on Earth, the very first thing that they do is they come out of their spaceship and they say, "Take me to your leader." We have an expectation in our culture that somebody has to be in charge, that we organize human beings in a hierarchy, and that somebody has to have control, and that person makes the decision. And we organize not only our military and our agencies and our schools and everything else along that, we organize our families. So that is simply the norm in our culture. Batterers practice. They practice in middle school. They practice in high school. They practice with people that they feel that they can control. And what they find is it's very reinforcing. If I threaten to shove you down into the gravel on the playground, and unless you do what I say, and you do what I say, I've been strongly rewarded for my behavior. So batterers tend to practice. As I said, this is where the whole issue of learning and family of origin comes in. They might have witnessed and learned the power of all of these tactics in their family of origin. They might learn it on the school ground, because to this day, if a girl is being teased by a boy, and she goes and she complains to a grown-up, you know, he's pulling my hair, he's pushing me, the grown-up is very likely still to say, he's just doing that because he likes you. So they learn it in schools, and they certainly also amongst peer groups, it's reinforced. So lots of folks. All right, well, we all grew up in the same environment. We all grew up with bullying in school. We all grew up with the same media images about relationships. We all listened to the same songs. We all saw the same stupid TV shows and commercials. So how come we all aren't batterers? There's a few they aren't all the same, but we can make a few generalizations about what sets the batterer mindset apart. Now, I can't tell you why, of these two people who grew up in the same town, same situation, why this one batters and that one doesn't. But I can tell you what's different about the way they think. I can't tell you why they think that way, but I can tell you what's different about the way they think. And so these are those batterer traits. This is the hallmark of batterer thinking. And the key is entitlement. Batterers believe that they batter because they believe they're entitled to. And the best way to try and explain that is with this kind of a little diagram. If you picture kind of an average person, okay, happy little average person, that should be on your screen right now. And then kind of these are my boundaries. This is my rights. This is what I'm entitled to. This is what I can expect from people. This is how I can expect to be treated. And particularly, this is how I can expect to be treated within my private, intimate relationships. So these are my rights, my entitlements. And then you take a batterer, and you look at what a batterer's sense of their entitlements, what their rights are, what they get to have in their intimate relationship, and it's way expanded. People will say, oh, batterers have low self-esteem. And really, it's kind of the opposite. They have intrusive self-esteem, which is not a happy thing for their partner, right? And everything then falls from this. So if I feel like I have more rights than you, I'm betterer than you, the rules don't apply to me, then I have the right to treat you however I want. And my rights supersede, trample on your rights. So it's no wonder that batters are often self-centered, because they do think that they are above other people and above the rules. It's no wonder that they manipulate, because they should. They deserve to. You know, why not? They deserve to have these things happen. It's no wonder that they are disrespectful, that they can often have a good public image, because this sense of entitlement may be very limited. In other words, they may have that belief system about their intimate partner, but not necessarily that belief system about their coworkers or their buddies. So in those situations, they seem like everybody else, because they don't have the same belief system there. But within their intimate partnership, they have that sense of inflated ego, inflated rights. The fact that they are punishing comes from that. If I feel bad, it certainly isn't my fault. It must be your fault, and therefore you have to fix it. And if you can't fix it, I get to punish you. So absolutely, their partner is not only responsible for any of the batter's bad behaviors, but even the batter's bad feelings. If I'm angry, it's your fault. If I'm sad, it's your fault. Unreasonable demands. I get to have sex whenever I want. You have to want the same things I want out of a relationship, or even unacceptable and unreasonable demands about children. What their level of ability to be quiet, or hold still, or clean, or have good manners at the table. Just not understanding developmental levels of children. If I have a right to all of these things, I can use whatever tactic I want to achieve them, and that means not only the anger, but I can be charming. I can do whatever I want, and that's fine. And so they can switch. Since this is a controlled behavior, it isn't about being out of control. It isn't about raging. They have the ability to switch to whatever they think will work at any point in time. And that explains then these series of phone calls that you may have heard, where somebody brings in their voice messages, and the first one from the batter is the whining, pleading, oh, please come back to me. I just want to talk to you one more time. I don't know how I'll live without you. Oh, baby, I love you. And then 2 seconds later, there's a voicemail that's, pick up the phone, you fucking bitch. And then 2 seconds later, one that's back to the, oh, I need you so much, sobbing, oh, I'll kill myself without you. So whatever will work, and just switch until they find the hook that functions for them at that point in time. Obviously, if this is a personal belief system and it's not about that victim, it explains why they're abusive in one relationship after another. And if it also explains why they become more dangerous when that victim attempts to leave, because you simply do not have the right to do that to me. I know I'm talking a mile a minute. I always have. I actually really enjoy talking about batters and learning about batters. I have more enjoyment talking about batters now than I do about dynamics of domestic violence and impacts on victims, et cetera, et cetera. It feels like I've done that so much that I really am relieved to talk about the true source and the problem, So everything I've said so far applies to all of these different kinds of batters. There are some batters then also will have the additional traits, batter beliefs. Some of them have rigid gender role beliefs. Not all of them. I would say most of them do. But and many of them do, and it's not really right out there. Some of them, it's barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. I did meet a woman one time at the courthouse who had walked in several miles on gravel roads to get to the courthouse to get a restraining order barefoot, because one of the things that her husband did was he would not allow her to own shoes, because that way he could keep her literally down on the farm, barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. So sometimes it's right out there, and sometimes it's really not, and they may hold positions where it would shock you. They might volunteer at a domestic abuse agency. They may be very engaged in kind of gender equity stuff. But something changes when it's their personal, intimate relationship. So they may or may not have those rigid beliefs. They may demonstrate extreme jealousy, and I just love the term conjugal paranoia. It just flows off my tongue. It's a lovely term, conjugal paranoia. In other words, she's sleeping with everybody, I know it. And that kind of leads to that possessiveness. Most of them have that. There are some who have so depersonalized their partner. They see her as such an object that they don't actually have that. And they have more of a, you know, I can throw her away and I can get another one tomorrow attitude, which, you know, it has its benefits and limits. If she leaves, they're less likely to pursue, but because they see her as more of an object when she's there, the beatings themselves might be more severe because she truly is not a human being. And then that extreme jealousy and everything, that goes with the scared of abandonment. Most of them are, but the ones that have that, as she's nothing, may not have that fear of abandonment that goes with the paranoia and possessiveness. Okay, Kirsten is going to pause for breath. Does anybody have a question? I'm not seeing any in my text. I'm not seeing any hands raised. Let me see where I'm at. And check my time too. Okay. I love, you know, I'm an internet junkie, so this is my one of my findings, drive-through DNA testing, which I think had to have been invented by a batterer. Okay, not all batterers stalk. We'll talk about stalking in our second hour, but some do. Not all, most of them do not assault outside the family, but some do. Many, you know, some of them have the, quote, controlling personality where their coworkers would say, oh, you don't want to work with Dr. So-and-so, what a jackass. But many don't. Again, it's a matter of who they believe they have those entitlements around. Some of them are very irresponsible. Others, so the irresponsible ones, it might be they already have petty criminal history for theft, for drunk driving, you name it. A host of them, and in others, it's the upright, upstanding citizen. Okay, so this is a pattern of criminal thinking that I'm going to go through next, which actually applies to any crime, but we're going to apply it to batterers. Oh, I do see a question. What percentage rate do you have for batterers that actually change? We have a 1% stat that we work with. Well, I can jump ahead and talk about that. The problem with, here we go, successive intervention. The problem is we don't know. The Centers for Disease Control did do a large multi-site study back in 2000. Actually, it was over several years, so it was completed in 2000, where they looked at different programs. And what they found is, first of all, half of, and again, they were looking at heterosexual male batterers, and they found that half of the folks that were court-ordered to treatment did not complete it. In other words, they didn't show up. They were thrown out because they were drunk or they weren't doing their homework, etc. So only about half of them were even completing the programs. Now, after that, what they found, and this is by interviews with current and former partners, as well as things like further arrest records, what they found was that a year after they'd completed, about 75% had not physically reassaulted their partners. And they felt that they had pretty good validity on that, because when they were interviewing the partners, the partners were talking pretty openly about a lot of very intimate personal things. So they felt pretty good about getting the true scoop from their partners. So about 75% a year after completing had not physically reassaulted. However, if you looked at the other forms of power and control, only about 25% of the 50% that finished stopped using the other control tactics a year after finishing. So it seemed to be much easier to teach batters to quit breaking the law than to teach them to truly get the idea of power and control and to stop using those things on their partners. And then there have been some follow-up stuff after that looking at more than 1 year out, and needless to say, the rates kind of decline from there. So intervention is not terribly successful. We don't actually have it down what works. We need to do something, obviously, and I always say, well, the something we've got is better than nothing. But I do think one of the things that it absolutely hinges on motivation of that particular batter, and they're not very highly motivated to change. Battering works so well, it does get your needs met. So we have to find ways to make the costs of battering outweigh the benefits. And once the costs of battering outweigh the benefits, people will be motivated to change. I think this is very similar to substance abuse treatment, where you hear that people don't respond to treatment, they don't necessarily change their behaviors until they've hit rock bottom. In other words, the cost of their using now outweighs any benefits of using. And I think that absolutely applies to battering. So, another thing about the batter treatment program, there's a couple things. One is that for at least 2 hours a week here in Iowa, she knows where he is, and that is helpful. At least for 2 hours a week, somebody's holding him accountable, and that can be helpful. I am concerned about giving people false hope. I'm concerned about it being not only false hope for their partner, thinking, well, he's going through treatment, I will be safe now, but also false hope for example, judges during custody proceedings where the judge might say, well, he's been through treatment, so now he's a safe parent. So there's lots of ways that I do have concerns about batters treatment, but I think there's no way to improve it except to keep slogging through it and keep looking at what we're doing and try to keep experimenting, essentially. We need to keep experimenting. Okay, that was a very long answer, but I was going to talk about that anyway, so we just jumped ahead to that part of our discussion. So we're back to batter beliefs. Now, first of all, if you want to talk about classical Freudian projection, batterers are not terribly trustworthy, and so they don't feel that they can trust anybody else. They kind of, if I lie, if I manipulate, then everybody else in the world must be too. So they're coming from a place of nobody else is trustworthy, and kind of look out for number one. So that's kind of the foundation. And then there's this criminal thinking of, I'm not doing anything wrong. And if it is wrong, I won't get caught. If I'm caught, I'll talk my way out. And if I can't talk my way out, the penalties will be light. If we look at that in terms of domestic violence, I'm not doing anything wrong. I am entitled to do these things. Our history and our social norms all substantiate that I'm not doing anything wrong. If it is wrong, I won't get caught. And I've been battering my partners for years and years and years, and even if the police show up, I might not be arrested. So that's substantiated. I mean, the batter is not wrong in those beliefs. If I'm caught, I'll talk my way out. And again, they are very good talkers. They may talk themselves into a lower charge. They may talk themselves into not being arrested. They may talk the victim into dropping a restraining order, etc. If I can't talk my way out, the penalties will be light. And again, unfortunately, regardless of what level of a domestic charge, unless it's your third offense, you're talking about a misdemeanor. They're very, very rarely charged as felonies. And the minimum penalty for all of them, which is usually what people get, is 2 days in jail with credit for time served. And that means most of them can do that time standing on their head. So the penalties will be light. I'll pay a fee. I'll spend my 2 days in jail. I will have to go to the batter's education program for 24 weeks, and that's it. And that's just not enough motivation for most of them to change their behavior. Now, I would guess that looking at those belief systems, you're probably thinking, wow, that is really screwed up criminal thinking. But if you apply it to yourself, some of you may, on some occasion, and I'm not, I'm just making the assumption, some of you may have at some point violated the speed limit. I do that once in a while myself, right? Of course, everybody else does it. I don't do it in bad weather. I don't do it at night. I don't do it within the city limits. I really, lots of Iowa, and I travel all over Iowa, lots of Iowa is really flat and empty and in some cases boring. And there's nobody there, and so I speed. And if you're talking about Highway 80, there's something weird that happens where if you head west and you go the speed limit, you're probably okay. But if you head east, those trucks will kill you if you're going the speed limit. You got to speed up, and particularly between Iowa City and Davenport. So what I just told you is that even though I speed, even though I break that law, I'm not doing anything wrong. If it is wrong, I won't get caught, because after all, I won't be the fastest speeder, because I can tuck in behind a truck, because I will slow down when I'm approaching a hill and at the top see how far, and if everything is clear, then I'll zoom till the next hill. What I'm telling you is I won't get caught. And I've worked for ICADWA, traveling around training now for 14 years, and I've been pulled over for speeding twice. And I can guarantee you I have sped more than twice. If I'm caught, no, I've been pulled over 3 times, because if I'm caught, I'll talk my way out. I've been pulled over 3 times. I've only gotten 2 tickets. If I can't talk my way out, the penalties will be light. You bet, because I had to pay a fine, and that's it. I'm not going to lose my license. I don't have enough traffic violations that I have to go to some driving class or anything else. All I have to do is pay a fine. And so that's really like road tax. That's speeding tax. If I pay that once in a while, twice every 14 years, then I get to speed. It's not worth it to me to change my behavior. I will continue to break that law. So that's criminal thinking in action, whether you're talking about a batterer or perhaps yourself. So maybe they're not so screwed up and crazy and strange as people want them to believe, want to believe about them. We kind of touched on this. Everybody makes their decisions about if they are going to take a particular action based on a cost-benefit analysis. And the benefits for battering are big. When you ask a batterer, what do you want out of a relationship? They will say a lot of the same things that you might say. They'll say, I want love, I want respect, I want stability. And at the same time, what those things might mean, love means you do everything for me and you do what I say, right? Respect means fear. You don't argue with me, you do what I say. And stability means I get everything my way, how I want it, when I want it. So there's a little bit of distortion there in the actual meaning of those words. But nevertheless, that is what they are aiming for. And when you batter, you are likely to get those and to get them immediately. And when you look at the costs of battering, those are much more unsure. It kind of depends on if you get caught. My partner may leave or they may not. I might lose my kids or I may not. I might have to go to jail. Might lose my guns. Probably not. So, and those outcomes are much farther down the road. We are a very immediate gratification society as well. So, big chance that I will immediately get these things. Small chance that 9 months down the road I might have some negative consequences. That's not going to change anybody's behavior. Okay, I'm going to just check my time one more. Okay, got a little bit more time. I'm just looking for questions or comments. Alrighty. Going to move on. 3 requirements to a criminal act. And again, this is Criminology 101, and we'll apply it to domestic violence. First of all, you have to have access to your victim. Second, you have to have some kind of impetus to commit that act. Think of that as again, this idea of motivation or drive, desire. And that can be both internal and external, and I'm going to go over these one-on-one in just a second. The third part to any criminal act is your inhibitions have to be lifted. So there's disinhibition. When you think about access, the person that you have absolutely the most access to is, of course, your intimate partner. You know, even with my ex-husband, I know where he is right now. I know his friends. I know his family. I have his Social Security number. And when we look at how we've tried to prevent this particular crime in the past, we've tried to prevent it by preventing access. In similar ways that we try to prevent burglary. We put locks, we put security cameras. One of the ways we try and stop crime is by preventing access with limited results. Because if batterers want to find their victim, they usually can. They can usually get there. Okay. Then there's that impetus. As I said, that can be external or internal. Let's say you have, man comes home, finds his wife in bed with another man. Probably that is some kind of motivation and desire that is sparked there to take some kind of action. Now, that person could yell and scream at the wife, yell and scream at the other man, could assault and or kill the wife, assault and or kill the other man, could calmly say, "You will be hearing from my attorney in the morning," and take the kids and leave. Could go away and write a sad letter. Could take off their clothes and join them. So I've just come up with 5 different options of actions that somebody could take in that same situation. So even though external circumstances can create the impetus to take action, action is not the same thing as using violence. You still have the choice around which action you take. So it's not the same thing as provocation. That's an external example. An internal example might be the batterer who is monitoring the partner's odometer and knows exactly how many miles it is to the grocery store and back, and looks at it and says, "Hey, there's 2/10 of a mile more on there than she said. She said she was going to the grocery store. So where did she really go?" And gets in the car and drives it, and yep, it's longer than what she said. And then says, "I wonder where that old boyfriend of hers lives. I wonder how far that is," and drives that and says, "Hey, that's about the same amount," and starts working the tape in his head. "She must be seeing somebody. I knew I can't trust her. You can't trust women. They always sleep around," and works it up in their head until they are motivated to take action. Right? This is a connection that is very hard to break, and it is one of the connections that the Batterers Education Program has to address. That no matter what happens, and everything you say about your partner might be true. She might be the worst bitch anybody has had to put up with, because of course they'll always tell you that. Yet, even so, you still have choices in your actions in dealing with that person. In fact, if she is so nasty and terrible, instead of tracking her down and bringing her back to the relationship, let her go. Just let her go. There's an option. Okay, and the third part to any criminal act is losing the inhibitions. We all do have inhibitions that prevent us from committing crimes. That there is something in your soul that says, don't steal, don't dance on the table, don't swear in front of your granny, right? And yet, things can happen. Perhaps you have been out of work for so long, you have no money, you can't feed your kids, and you pass by that grocery store every single day, and they have fresh bread out, with the smell to entice everybody, and that inhibition to steal is removed by your desperation, and you grab a loaf of bread as you pass by, okay? Something has to happen to remove your inhibitions. Or you are drunk, and the alcohol has removed your inhibitions, and now you're dancing on the table. Or you're at the family reunion, right, and you drop the casserole on your foot, and the pain makes you yell, "Oh shit," right in front of your granny. So if we apply that to domestic violence and look at what are the things that remove people's inhibitions about using violence toward their intimate partner, then we can see where all of these things play in. Again, that family of origin stuff, our media, our culture, our history, our traditional gender roles. This may be a place where substance abuse comes in terms of the actual physical violence. The criminal thinking, I'm not wrong, and if I'm wrong, all of that plays into removing a batterer's inhibitions. And so one of the things we can do to work towards stopping that criminal behavior is to increase the inhibition, to make it worse. And if you look at things like Mothers Against Drunk Driving have been incredibly successful in changing our cultural beliefs around drunk driving and actually intoxication in general. When I was very little, you could watch on any family hour TV show in the evening, the town drunk or somebody being drunk was considered family entertainment. So there was always a comic relief character. There were skits. Being drunk was just not taken very seriously. It was comic relief, and it was considered to be acceptable for children. You don't see the town drunk as comic relief in family hour television anymore. It's just not okay. And our ideas around drunk driving have changed significantly, and largely through social change efforts by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We pretty much have to do a similar effort around domestic violence, and I do think we've come a long way. If nothing else came out of the O.J. Simpson case, it brought the whole issue into public debate. Prior to that, people still really were not talking about domestic violence. Afterwards, the conversation shifted to knowing it existed and asking, well, what do we do about it? And so that's a substantial shift. Any other questions? Just, type furiously and interrupt me. This is a lot of material to cover in a very short time. And that's why I encourage you to go ahead and download and read the manual sections, because it will go over this material again instead of me just spewing it out at rapid fire rate into your ears. Alrighty, Batter's Education Program. The Iowa Code says any person convicted of domestic abuse must attend. Here in Iowa, and this is not true in other states, it is through the Department of Corrections. It is a 24-week program here. It uses what's called the Duluth model, which is based on, the curriculum was developed in Duluth, Minnesota. That's what Duluth refers to. And it uses that power and control wheel, and it is cognitive and skills-based. In other words, it's not anger management. It's not group counseling. It's not really focused on what they feel. Don't really care whether they're angry or whether they had a bad childhood, et cetera, et cetera. What it's focused on is, what do you believe? And trying to use activities and change the skills they have in relationships to change that belief system. Okay. I want to do a quick exercise that would be very similar to something that they would actually do in the Batters program here in Iowa, to kind of give you a flavor of it. And so I'm hoping this works. I've got a little film clip here. It's from the movie Chocolat, and I've got two clips. They're about 2 minutes apiece. And so we'll watch them, and then we're going to go through what's called a control log. And the control log is a tool that's used in the batter's education program all the time. So the batters would be watching a clip, not this particular one, but they would be watching a clip showing one of the tactics on the power and control wheel. So it might be a clip about emotional abuse or isolation or using the kids. And then they have to analyze that clip using the control log. And then often for homework, they have to come up with an occasion when they used that particular tactic and go through the control log again, analyzing that event and what happened. So here's the first clip. This man's wife has left him because of domestic violence and moved in with a friend. And he has been cleaned up by the town mayor and sent off to bring his marriage back together. So. And mine has frozen. There it goes. And Liliana, I got your question, and I'll answer it as soon as the clip's done. Okay. Hopefully that broadcast to me just fine. Hopefully it broadcast to you just fine. And Liliana said that she had a client whose husband was charged with domestic violence, but he didn't have to do the BEP. And I guess I have a couple questions for that. One is, was he actually sentenced on domestic violence? In other words, somebody could be charged, and then they may not be convicted. You have to be convicted. The charges might have been dropped. And sometimes the client that you're working with doesn't really know what happened with the case. So was he sentenced, or was it dropped from a domestic charge to some other form of assault or some other form of charge, in which case the requirement for the batter's education program goes away. A judge could still order it if the judge chose to, but if it's dropped from a domestic assault to just a simple assault, then the judge is not required to order the batter's education program. And so something there might have happened too. So the question, the first thing I would ask is, what was that? What was the client's partner actually sentenced on? What charge? And then sometimes judges just throw that requirement out illegally. Sometimes they'll say, well, this batterer would have to travel too far, and that's not fair. Or this batterer, it'd be too much money. Or even this batterer would need a Spanish-speaking group, and there isn't one in this area, so I'm not going to order it because they couldn't go to group anyway. So once in a while, you'll have a judge that will essentially ignore the law and do whatever they want because there's not much accountability for judges. That's my answer to that. And I've got people who say they're not able to see the clip. Well, I tell you what, I don't know if everybody else, I don't know if most people saw it or not. I'm going to skip the next clip, which is simply then he comes back later. The same batter comes back later that night. He's gotten drunk and he breaks in and he breaks through the door and assaults the wife and assaults the friend that she's staying with, etc. So, you know, you're familiar with that stuff. Nope, people couldn't see the clip. Okay, well, let's just go over the control log questions so you at least get an idea of how this is dealing with the belief system and how the batters would have to think about their choices. So the first question on control log is actions. In other words, what actions did you see in the clip? And so they would have to talk about what parts of the power and control wheel were there, and you know, were there, you know, how subtle was it? Maybe it was a matter of a particular look. So describing what they saw in the clip, and then with their homework, then describing what actions they themselves took when they used one of those control strategies, control tactics. Then the second question is, what did you want to have happen? You know, so in the clip, what did the batterer want to have happen in that thing that they watched? And then for themselves, what was their goal? You know, was it to get her to shut up? Was it to make it so that he didn't have to watch the kids that night and he could go out to the bar with his friends? Was it because he wanted to spend money and she had a different idea of how she wanted to spend the money? And then what beliefs supported that? You know, was the belief of, well, the kids aren't really my responsibility, they're a woman's responsibility? Or is it that I made the money, I make more money than her, so I get to decide what it is? Or is it simply, you know, the man gets to make the rules? What's the underlying belief system that supported that action? There is a question about feelings. What feelings were you having? And then kind of getting underneath it. Well, angry. Well, why would you feel angry? Well, maybe it was because he was scared she was going to leave, or maybe it was because he felt insecure about taking care of the kids, or maybe because that anger, as I said, is a mask. If you go back to those circles, these ones, if you tell a batterer that what they actually are entitled to is a circle the size of the average person's and no more, they're going to compare that to what they think they're entitled to, and they're going to get pissed. They're going to feel victimized. You're taking something away from me. You're not treating, you know, you're only giving me this little piece when I should get this big piece. And so they don't batter because they're angry. They are angry because they are a batterer. They often present themselves very convincingly as the victim because they truly believe that something is being taken away from them. They truly believe that they are being mistreated because they should be getting so much more. And when their victim says, no, you only get the same amount I do, or when the counselor says no, or the police officer or the judge says, no, you really truly only get this much, it is no wonder that they can talk very, very convincingly about being victimized, that they seem angry, etc., etc. They feel like they are being harmed by being treated the same as everybody else. Okay. So we'll get ourselves back to the control log. So what feelings were they having? And let's get past the anger. Let's talk about some of the underlying stuff. And then what ways do minimization, denial, and blame fit in there? You know, maybe he figures, well, it's not like, if it was emotional abuse example, well, it's not like I hit her or anything. Denial. Minimization. Well, it's not like, you know, she didn't get to pick what we did for vacation, you know, last year, even if that's not true. Sometimes a very convenient memory. So they would ask those kinds of questions, and then what was the effect of that action on the perp? Because, you know, it's all about him. So what was the effect on him? Did he actually get what he wanted? And short-term and long-term. Long-term, did it actually develop trust? Did you actually feel respected and loved? Or did your partner distance themselves actually from you emotionally and maybe even physically because you used that? The effect on the victim and the effect on others. Maybe children, maybe neighbors that saw it, other family members. So that's, and then how did past violence affect this? So the look is effective this time because he beat the snot out of her last time, and so he doesn't have to do that again. So really holding them accountable for the fact that whatever they did in the past, it still follows them. It is reasonable for their partner to still be afraid of them, even though, quote, he didn't hit her this time. So that is, and the last question is, then what else could you have done? It's not enough to tell people, no, don't do that. You have to focus on telling them what to do. So in the Batterers Education Program, as it stands today, and we are looking at changing how the curriculum works and what's being used, but as it stands today, 1 week they might take emotional abuse, for example. Talk about that, go through control logs on it, really pick that apart. That's the don't do this, this is the bad. Then the next week has to be, okay, well, what do you do instead? And that's where that partnership wheel comes in. The opposite of emotional abuse is respect. So what is respect? Pick that apart. Is it fear? Or is it something different? Who do you respect? And why do you respect them? How do you show somebody you respect them? How would you use that in your intimate relationship? So the second week is replacing the bad behavior with an alternative. And then the third week is practicing the alternative. So that's the model, is to not just say no, but to replace it with positive relationship skills. And we kind of talked about how successful it is. Another thing that particular study on success, and there have been tons of studies, and there are week-long conferences about batter intervention and what works and what doesn't, and how do we even measure what works. But at least in that one, what they found was that if there was a coordinated response from all the folks in the system, then more people were likely to complete the program, and they were more likely to be nonviolent. And that makes sense, because if there is a loophole somewhere, the batterer will find it and escape through it. So if the loophole is that if I just don't show up for BEP, I don't get sent back to court, there's no contempt charges filed, then they just won't show up. If the court is not firm in their order, if probation just lets things go, if they're thrown out and says, well, okay, let's try anger management instead, they all have to work together. Some of the things that have concerned me in the last couple of years, again, this is an economic issue in Iowa, is that the money for, if somebody was not in compliance or was thrown out, et cetera, what is supposed to happen is they're supposed to be sent back to court. And then the judge can order them a little thought time in jail. Okay, you're going to go back to jail for 7 days. Have some time to think about whether or not you really need to take the batterers program, and then you get to start it over. Lucky you. Even if you were on week 23 before something happened, you get to start it over at week 1. That's what is supposed to happen. And as money has dried up, the staffing necessary to track that, to write up and file the warrants to have people arrested again, or to have the paper sent out to order them back to court, all of that has dried up. And so the follow-through has significantly fallen off, and I'd be very curious if we look at completion rates, if we're not going to see then lower completion rates, and if we had some capacity to interview their partners, if we aren't seeing that it's not working. They're not being held accountable, and therefore we have lower, quote, success rates. Okay, let's skip that question. Anything else about batterers? Because I will move on to stalking. It kind of follows on the heels of batterers pretty reasonably. If anybody is typing furiously. You can keep typing while I get stalking ready. And as I said, the handouts are in that same part of ICODVA website. In the resource library, under that tab, if you click on resource library, the first thing you'll find is this training manuals for advocates. Click on that. Here's your list. And so our handouts are down here. Batterers and BEP, and Section 8 is stalking. So there it is. And I might as well, as long as this is up. There's a couple things I want to point out actually in these written materials. Skip the statistics. I'm always bored by statistics. And then the next section is the stuff I'm going to blab at you here in a minute. But there is, this is a partial list of suggestions, because there's always ideas that could be thrown out there for stalking victims. But you could, print this off and hand it to somebody. Are any of these things helpful to you? So different ideas of things that might help somebody who's being stalked. There's also a stalking incident log, because that is one of the first things that you'll tell people is you've got to keep track of what's happening. And even if you're not sure, if it's just bothering you, write it down. If that car went by and there's just something funky about it, write it down. Or you came into your home and you think maybe somebody was here and you don't remember having the chairs pulled out, write it down. Because what you're trying to develop is some kind of a pattern. So this is just one sample log. At the bottom of that page, you'll see the Stalking Resource Center. It's a national center. They have a national hotline for stalking victims. And if you go to their website, they have a ton of other downloadable brochures, books, and different stalking logs and information for victims. So I definitely wanted you to take notice of their resources for both yourself and for the folks you're working with, and this log, because you'll need to give that to folks. There's also examples of where batterers might be getting your personal information, and it's things that folks don't necessarily think of. For example, if my partner always took the car to be to have the oil changed and do all of that stuff at Jiffy Lube, and that's a national chain, it's anywhere, and I have fled to another state and my partner doesn't know where I am, but just out of habit, because that's the name that rings a bell, I go to Jiffy Lube in my new state to get my car taken care of. He can go to a Jiffy Lube with his car and then say, oh, and by the way, I can't remember when I last had my wife's car here. Is it time for it to be, can you tell me if it's time for me to do the maintenance on that? And they'll pull it up on their computer and they'll go, oh, no, it was checked out, in March here in Ohio. Oh, well, thank you. Great. Now he got the information he needs. So there's some other ideas of places where batterers might be getting information, where stalkers. And the actual code itself is in those manual materials. So if you want to go back and have a good snooze reading the code some evening, there it is. Okay. All right. Now, when I have gone to trainings on stalking, I have found it very frustrating, because a lot of the time what they have is somebody come in, some national speaker come in, and they talk about their stalking department, or they have a stalking team. It's like, well, I don't think there's a police department in the state that's big enough to have a stalking team. Or they talk about David Letterman being stalked, Madonna. And that's just not helpful, because that's not who we're working with, and that's not the resources we have to deal with. So they don't really have a magic wand, and I don't have a huge magic wand either. I'm really more going to tell you the problem than give you a whole lot of solutions. So, sorry, you can walk away frustrated. Most stalkers are, in fact, ta-da, batterers. No surprise there. if you don't get to tell me no, if I'm entitled to whatever I want, telling me you don't want to be in a relationship with me is like the ultimate no. So it's likely that I might choose to stalk. So if it's that you told me no, or maybe there's some other action, batterers have what's called a narcissistic injury. They have this, they feel like their self has been violated by their victim, by telling them no, by saying whatever, by doing whatever. And those feelings are just intolerable. They're not willing to deal with that. And the only strategy that they can come up with to stop those feelings is to do something to target that partner. Okay? Oh, I have a nasty sound effect on this one. Oh well, at least you'll wake up and know when I've changed slides. So they really fall into 3 goals as far as what they might be trying to do to heal that narcissistic injury, if you want to put it that way. The first is reconciliation. I want to get my partner back, or I want to keep my partner in the relationship and not let them leave. And then that will fill the hole, and I'll feel good. Or vindication. I'm the victim here. They're the bad one. They did all of this. It's not my fault. And then if everybody is on my side and I can prove that my partner is the horrible one, then of course I will feel better because the world will side with me. Or simple revenge. If you feel as bad as you made me feel by leaving, then I guess I'll feel better. So just sheer punishment. And these things that don't happen in isolation. In other words, they may switch back and forth between one goal and the other very quickly. You might have, this is where you got the guy that goes to talk one last time. I just want to talk to you one last time so I can have closure. And that's reconciliation. You know, I'm just going to go there and I'm going to convince her to come back. But he happens to take along a knife and he stabs her when, you know, when his talking didn't work, then he immediately switches to revenge and kills her. So there's the 3 goals, and then there's sets of different behaviors that may accomplish any of those goals. And the first big set of behavior is gathering information. And I touched on that with the list of different places that batterers might get information. Stealing trash. So you've left. I don't know where you are, but I can steal your parents' garbage, and I can get their phone bills out and go through those phone numbers and see if there's anything there I don't recognize and call. Because if there's one person you're going to call, it's probably your folks. So if I can steal their garbage, I may be able to find you. I don't know if you have Googled your name lately, but give it a try. I have an unusual name. If you Google my name, you can find not only where I live, but you can get a photo of my house. You can get an aerial shot of my house, all within 5 minutes easily of very simple internet searching. So that's a big one for batterers who are stalking. Questioning mutual acquaintances. I have my youngest sister called me one time, and there was this guy that she had dated twice, and the second time he asked her to please pick him up for the date, for their second date. And when she went to pick him up at the address that he gave, it was the halfway house in town, the correctional facility. And she said, gee, I hope he works here. But of course, he was actually a resident. And he told her that he had been in prison for substance-related issues, but he was clean and sober and trying to get his life back together, and he deserved a second chance. And she said, well, I do believe that people deserve second chances. I'm not stupid. Kirsten, would you please find out about him? So I did, and we found out that he'd actually been in prison for domestic charges, which means he was really bad. There was an attempted kidnapping and dropping a baby in the street, a knife, and you name it, all involved. So she informed him that she didn't want to go out with him then on any subsequent dates. And we safety planned around that, and it all worked. He left her alone. But then she was calling me like 6 months later and saying, "Do you remember John?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I remember John. How could I forget John?" And she said, "Well, he just got off the phone with me. He said that he had been away, and he was back in town now, and of course you know what that means, where he was away. And he was looking her up, and he wanted to know if she wanted to start going out with him again." And then like the first question out of his mouth was, "Do you still work at Walmart?" She thought that was odd, so she said yes. And he said, "I know, they give you a really good job reference." What he had done is he had called Walmart as though she had applied for a job with him, and he was an employer, and gotten a job reference on her, and then gotten her phone number from them because she had moved. She changed her phone number. And, I'm sure did some run around, "Oh, it looks like she didn't put it down on this paper and she sounds really good. Do you have her number handy?" And the person he was talking to, of course, wanted to help her out to a better job and was quite happy to assist him with that. It's a great example of questioning a mutual acquaintance to get information. Through the course of the call, as she was saying, "No, really, coming up with any lie she could. I'm seeing somebody. I want to see where that goes." He said, "Well, Uppity Women Unite," which was the new bumper sticker on her car. So what he was also telling her is, "I know what your car looks like. I know the bumper sticker." He knew what her work schedule was. He'd been stalking her. He'd been following her. So he had gotten a lot of information through this general questioning, and nobody, people are not suspicious, and people shouldn't have to be suspicious. Let's just say that. And people are less suspicious than of partners in terms of giving information. They're quite willing to give information. Second big category of stalking behaviors is intimidation and threats. And it goes with that reconciliation. "I'll get you back by scaring you into coming back," or "I'll punish you by making you crazy," or "I'll threaten your reputation." It might be subtle, breaking in the house, moving stuff around so that you don't know if I've been there or not, and it just makes you nuts. It might be very, the note that says, "You're dead, bitch," might be very blatant. But a whole category there of intimidation and threats. Third category is punishment, punishing actions. So certainly the subsequent assaults. False reports, maybe to Child Protective Services, maybe that person is in some kind of profession where they are licensed and filing some kind of a report that would affect their licensing. Arson, absolutely, as a form of punishment. The general attempts to destroy your reputation, maybe on Facebook, maybe in a high school, rumors starting amongst friends to destroy her reputation. At ISU, there was a professor whose husband tried to kill her on campus. He attempted to stab her. She was an engineering professor. He did stab her, but he was not successful in actually killing her. And while he was awaiting trial, and then afterwards, when he was in jail, waiting being sent to prison, he was somehow able to get various accomplices to spam the faculty and students, particularly the faculty focused on at ISU, with stuff about how she had falsified her resume. She didn't have the degrees and the awards that she said she did. She was here in the country under false pretenses. Just you name it, whatever he could come up with to try and destroy her reputation. And they had a hard time getting a hold on that to stop that process from happening. And that's sheer punishment, internet stalking, even able to do that to her while he was in jail. Okay. One thing I want to put in your heads is the idea that violating a restraining order is stalking, is automatically stalking. And as we go through the stalking law, which we will here in a second, that will become even more clear. You have to have a couple components to prove a stalking case. And one is that this is a crime of intent. That's one of the reasons that prosecutors are very uncomfortable with the stalking code. It's very difficult to show what is in somebody's head. You can show what they do, but to show what is in their head is difficult. And so to show that the perp knew that what they were doing was causing fear can be a stumbling block for a prosecutor. If there's a restraining order in place, then that perp has been notified by no less than a judge that they need to stop what they're doing, that it's causing fear. They have been notified in the most formal way possible to cut it out. So you can, if they have a restraining order, you can prove what they know because a judge told them, right? Another thing that you have to have for stalking is that you have to have a pattern of behavior. And the Iowa Code defines it as 2 or more occasions. So the behavior had to have happened once in order for that victim to have gotten the restraining order. So there's number 1. And then if you can prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, if you can prove that it happened again in the violation of the restraining order, there's your pattern of 2 or more. So if you can prove in court that a restraining order was violated, you can prove the pattern element of a stalking crime. And the other thing to think about in terms of restraining order violations being stalking is that what you've got is a perpetrator who's saying, I don't care what my victim says, I don't care what the cops say, I don't care what the judge says. No one gets to tell me what to do. And when you have a perp who's refusing to have their behavior limited, when they are violating the order again and again and again, you have a very high-level danger perp. That is stalking, and we need to start, we think about violation of restraining order, and that doesn't sound as that bad of a crime. Stalking sounds like much worse of a crime, sounds much more scary and dangerous. We need to start thinking about violations of restraining orders as stalking because I think it will change the seriousness with which the system responds to it. And this is something that I talk with law enforcement about, that if someone is ignoring a judge, then you have a higher level perpetrator, and that's a red flag. So that is a perp you need to pay particular attention to. Stalking is one of the #1 red flags for an intimate partner homicide. When we look at what do these homicides have in common, one of the most frequent things that they have in common is stalking prior to the death. And again, what I've got up there is research done for the Centers for Disease Control. And they found 88% of their intimate partner homicides that they looked at had previous stalking behavior. And that stalking can occur whether or not that victim has left the relationship. If you've got somebody who's stalking their victim and they haven't even left yet, you've got a really dangerous perp. Okay. As I said, the manual has lots of different suggestions. There were just a couple that I wanted to touch on that are mentioned there. One is that stalking victims are often told, don't respond, don't do anything, don't talk to him if he comes up to you. And I would say that's probably good advice up to a point. But when you're trapped alone with your stalker, calming them down and engaging them might be a safer course. And victims will do this instinctively. And I think what we really need to teach them is to trust their instincts and to listen to that. That if they're feeling afraid, there's probably a good reason. And in fact, one of the key books on stalking is called The Gift of Fear. It's written by Gavin DeBecker. And one of the things it talks about is if you're afraid, pay attention to that. There's probably a good reason. So often when they are trapped alone, it is just natural to start the calm them down, talk to them, engage. I'm really confused right now, and everybody's been telling me what to do, and the police want me to do one thing, and my parents want me to do something else, and I just really need time to think about this. Rather than bold-faced, no. And the reason for that suggestion is that if you just go straight to, no, I'm not talking to you, and you are alone with that person, that you might trigger the revenge thing and you might be assaulted and or killed. So if a victim is later beating themselves up emotionally, saying, oh, I shouldn't have done that, why did I talk to them, now they just think, and I know you're never supposed to, they did instinctively what kept them alive then, and that's fine. They're alive, therefore it was the right choice. Once they're in a car alone, if they've been pushed into the car alone, or they got in the car and they're driving away someplace, at that point anything goes, because they simply need to get away as quickly as they can. I talked about documenting everything. Document, 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 document. One thing that often happens is that people immediately want to change their phone number. And I understand the impulse. But if you change your phone number, then your stalker knows that you've changed your phone number. And then they begin to intensively work to get your new one. So if that victim can at all afford it, and they can just leave that first line alone, and instead get a second line or get a second cell phone or whatever, leave the old number active, that becomes the stalker's personal private stalking line. They can call, you can gather evidence there, and they're not triggered to start looking for your new number. And then you're very careful, of course, about who you give that new number out to. As I said, prosecutors are not terribly fond of these cases. They are harder to prove in court than some of the other possible charges like harassment. So to some extent, you and she are going to have to be your own attorneys and private investigators and put together the case to take to the prosecutor. Put together that log. Put together the evidence. Write the story so that you can go in and show that things have escalated, that you can show the pattern of events, so that you can have, okay, here's a tape that has all of the answering machine calls. Here's printouts of all of the emails. You're going to have to sell it first quite often. I think most of the other victim stuff is all in the manual, and you can pull that out and read it. So let's, yay, go to the actual law. Stalking is covered in 708. It's part of our assault code. And we are going to pick apart the elements. You have to purposefully engage in a course of conduct directed at a specific person, or immediate family member that would cause a reasonable person to fear bodily injury or death. So that's one. You have to show the course of conduct. Another piece of it, you have knowledge or should have knowledge, and this is that you got to show what's in the person's head, that that specific person or immediate family member would be placed in a reasonable fear of bodily injury or death. So you have to have that element too. You also have to have actually caused fear. In other words, if I stalk you and you're not afraid of me, and this has happened sometimes too, where I'm sure you've encountered victims who refuse to admit that they're afraid. And any reasonable person would be afraid, and you know in your gut that they are afraid. But somehow saying, and particularly saying in court so that the batterer hears it, saying that they're afraid means that he wins. Gives him the satisfaction that he knows he's caused harm. And so they're just not willing to do that. And that can destroy that prosecutor's case if the victim is not in fear. They don't have a case. So when you have one of these tough victims, you may need to talk with them around what their concerns are about being afraid. Okay, if they're not afraid, what would their concerns about being afraid, what would it mean to them if they were afraid? And kind of dig into that somewhere. The final element is that it has to be, as I said, a pattern, and that means 2 or more occasions. Let's go into that a little bit further. So what is a course of conduct? Well, a course of conduct means repeatedly maintaining a visual or physical proximity to a person without legitimate purpose. So if you keep hanging out in my front yard and there's no reason for you to be there, that would count. Or repeatedly conveying oral or written threats, threats implied by conduct, a combination thereof, directed at a specific person. And we had a nice court case where batterer was in the courthouse with victim at a restraining order hearing, oddly enough, got the restraining order placed against him. Victim goes to the clerk's office there at the courthouse immediately after the hearing. Batterer follows, goes in and out of the clerk's office several times. The victim just stays there. She's not going to leave until he's gone. He's hanging out in the hallway. Finally, he leaves for a minute. She still hangs out just to be sure he's gone. He comes back with a video camera. And then by that time, the clerk is called to have a sheriff come up and escort the victim from the clerk's office down to her car in the parking lot. And as the victim's being escorted, the batterer videotapes the entire thing. Now he says that, and he's subsequently charged, he says that his videotaping it was to prove that this is all a setup, that he didn't even want to approach her, that he did not approach her, he didn't talk to her, etc., etc. And that he videotaped to show his nonviolent intent, that she just sets him up. The judge ruled, however, that any reasonable person in those circumstances would have felt threatened, so that was a threat implied by his conduct. That was visual and physical proximity. He didn't have to speak to her. He didn't have to threaten her verbally or in writing. That course of conduct in and of itself, that a reasonable person would find that scary, to have their batterer doing that. So it can be broadly interpreted. There's a reference there in the code to immediate family member, and the law specifies who that is. So you could be stalking me if you place me in fear that you're going to harm my child. Or if there was somebody who lived in my house recently and you're placing me in fear about them. You're sending me notes and me letters and stuff. Maybe you're taking pictures of them in the grocery store and sending them to me as a threat to me that you're going to harm them in order to stalk me or get me to come back to you. So it's not just that person. It can also be immediate family members. Okay. Actually, I think I want to go back just a little because there's something else I want to talk about. And that is reasonable fear of bodily injury or death. Because there is a problem there that battered women often face when we're talking about reasonable person standards. In that a reasonable battered woman might be different than a reasonable person on the street. If you beat the snot out of me one time after I had spent the day canning tomatoes, and you came home and you were pissed off at the mess, you were pissed off that dinner wasn't ready, and you beat the snot out of me. And then you send me a can of tomatoes in the mail. I, as your former partner, may see that as a threat that a reasonable person would not. And so you have to be sometimes battered women have to go the extra mile to show why they are in fear and why it is reasonable for the coded messages that a stalker might send to be placing them in fear. And I just got a question from Sherry. So what you just stated is stalking may be done by third-party members, that is, by a batterer's family or friend. Actually, yes, a batterer could use a family or friend to send messages. That person wouldn't be charged with stalking. They might be charged with being an accessory to the crime. But the third party would be, let's say I left you and I moved away. I'm now in Wisconsin, and you're stalking me by sending me threats in my email and by sending me stuff that lets me know that you know where I am, and I'm not sure how you're knowing that stuff. And then you start sending me photos that you're taking of my parents, let's say, and saying that if I don't come back to Iowa, if I don't come back to you, you'll harm my parents. Well, you would think that it would be the parents, since the parents are the ones being directly physically threatened, that they should be the ones that are the stalking target. But actually, because the purpose of the stalking is to get at me, I am the stalking target. So you can stalk me by threatening to harm a family member of mine. So that's what I mean by that. I mean, there could be additional charges based on a threat to that person, but you're stalking me by threatening to harm somebody else. Let's say you threaten to kidnap my child as a way to control my behavior, to engage in a course of conduct that would put me in fear. So they kind of had to have it broad because stalkers, domestic violence tends to spread. It's kind of contagious, and it tends to spread to immediate family members, and they'll target whomever they think I have an emotional tie to get me. And so that's why it's kind of past just that individual person, but extends to family members. Okay, so your baseline stalking charge is an aggravated misdemeanor, which is the highest misdemeanor level that you can go. If you're doing any of the things there on the list, if there's already a restraining order and you are still stalking, you're violating that order, it can be bumped up. It is bumped up automatically to a Class D felony. So think about it. If you have somebody who is repeatedly violating a restraining order, that could be charged as contempt of court. It could be dealt with in a civil lawsuit, contempt of court. It could be charged criminally. Or that could be charged as felony, Class D felony stalking, which means that we take it much more seriously if we think about it as, wait a minute, this is actually a felony that this person is violating this restraining order. So it completely changes the way we think about those restraining order violations once we start using the term stalking. If they're stalking while in possession of a dangerous weapon, if the target is a minor, or if this is a second offense, just like the domestic abuse charges are bumped up on subsequent offenses, the stalking offense is bumped up each subsequent time. So then on your third stalking, it's automatically a Class C felony. Okay, well, my voice certainly, I can tell that I've been talking nonstop for 2 hours. Are there any questions about stalking? About anything that I covered there very quickly? I covered very, very quickly. While I'm waiting to see if there's things, actually, if you have questions about stalking, or if you want me to back up and talk about something about batters in general, or about the Batters Education Program, I'd be happy to do that. Another thing about intervention that I'll blab on about while I'm waiting for questions, intervening with stalking, is that your only avenue is not necessarily going straight to the prosecutor, and the only avenue is not necessarily stalking charges. One thing that, and this is anecdotal report, that people say has sometimes worked as kind of a first step is to find a sympathetic law enforcement officer, explain what's going on, and have that officer go and just talk to that person. If you have somebody who is a stalker who is largely pro-social, in other words, by and large, they don't have a big criminal history. They are motivated to keep a good reputation in their community. They don't want to lose their job over this. They don't want people to know what's happening. If you have that kind of a stalker, then having a cop show up and say, been getting these complaints, I'm expressing concern, I'm concerned about you, I don't want to have to arrest you or anything, and here's the key question. Tell me how what you are doing is being misunderstood. It's a key question because it automatically assumes that the person is stalking, they're doing something, and it gets them to tell the cop, to admit to stuff, to say what they've been doing, because batterers are very much willing to talk about their victimization, usually. I'm making broad, sweeping statements, of course. All of this is always broad, sweeping statements. So tell me how what you're doing is being misunderstood is saying, please explain yourself to me. I want to be on your side. Oh, she must be such a bitch. Tell me what's going on. And batterers are often willing to then lay it out. That gives that officer confirmation and information about what has happened, about what's probable to happen in the future. And so then the follow-up is, I don't want to have to arrest you. Here's the way the law is, and if you keep this stuff up, I'm going to be on your doorstep again. And so you need to knock it off. And it's a knock it off that it seems like it is, again, on that stalker's side. And having that spotlight, and yet it being sympathetic, being shown on their behavior, has in some cases managed to de-escalate the situation, where for at least a while they have backed off, slowed down, given their victim some breathing space. So that might be one informal route to try as kind of some first steps in getting some kind of a handle on stalking behavior. Another avenue to try, as I said, prosecutors are not terribly happy about having to prove what's in people's heads. There are other charges. They aren't as rewarding because they are not taken as seriously. They're not felony charges. But maybe the prosecutor won't charge stalking, but they will go with harassment. They will go with stopping access to 911 if, for example, phone lines were cut or something. They may go with other minor things where they're more certain that they can actually get it past a jury. And again, that might not be a stalking charge, but it might bring the focus of the criminal justice system's attention onto that stalker so that they back off while they're under that lens, while they feel like they need to be a good boy so that the consequences don't escalate. And again, because we're talking about behavior that is within their control, if they're motivated to be a good boy for a while, they just might. So there may be some other informal strategies without the whole shebang of a stalking conviction that may reduce some of these behaviors or even eliminate them. A restraining order may be successful, maybe not. As always, and restraining orders is a whole different topic. I would strongly encourage you to check out the National Stalking Resource Center's website for more information, and to give that information, run it off, or give the website address to your clients so that they can feel like they have some kind of resource and access to tools. The one thing about stalking is that it is never fair and just. And at least it seemed for me like the hardest thing for the clients I worked with was to give that up. That they would say, it's not fair that I have to move. It's not fair that I'm going to have to change my job. It's not fair that. And the very first thing that they have to completely give up is the idea of fairness. They probably are going to have to move. They probably are going to have to change all these things. And fairness just isn't
isn't an issue. You have to just throw that one out the window and think about safety. And that can be sometimes the hardest hump to get over. That and then the grief about the loss that is involved in losing those things. But stubbornness will not keep her safe. I have recorded this session, and I will see what it takes to make it available, either by people emailing and asking for it or having it on the website. I don't know what they look like recorded. I know that there's both the visual of whatever is on my screen and the audio portion of it. But I kind of want to take a look at it and see how useful it is. But I have recorded it and intend to record the ones in the future so that they would be available for people to review. The next kind of in this series, if you want to call it a series, I'm going to try and cover most of those Certified Domestic Abuse Advocate, which is now what it's called, trainings, everything that's beyond that initial 24-hour training. I'm going to try and slowly go through them and get those covered in webinars, more or less. And the next one, I'm trying to see where it's in my calendar scheduled for. It will be, when will it be? It's listed on the iCodva website because I can't find it right now immediately in my calendar. But please feel free to sign up for that one too if that's what you need. And I thank everybody for coming. I hope that these become fewer technical difficulties, easier and more familiar as time goes by. So that is all I have to say, unless there are more questions. My office in the last 2 minutes has completely emptied out as everybody is running off to lunch. And my tummy tells me it's probably lunchtime and you're probably hungry too. Comment. Oh, thank you. It's just a thank you from Tina that at least she felt that it was that the explanations were good and that it was helpful. And if it was review for some of you, at least I hope that I like to go and hear people present because I always take away some phrase or some way of trying to explain this information to the general public. Even just a turn of phrase sometimes can be helpful to make it make sense. So much of domestic abuse people think is common sense, and actually it's not. And oh, good. Linda says that this was her first webinar and it worked well. Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you, Sherry. And thank you, people who asked questions. Great. Well, go off and have a good lunch. Your brain is now throbbing, so go take care of your throbbing brain and your empty belly. And I'm going to sign you all off. Thank you.